of those would be, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you about something that may seem simple on the surface, but has enormous implications for your health, your independence, and frankly, your lifespan. I'm talking about leg strength, specifically why your legs may be getting weaker after age 60, and more importantly, what you can do about it. Now, I know most people think of aging as a slow, steady decline, but that's not entirely accurate. What we often think of as aging is, in fact, the accumulation of preventable dysfunctions and loss of muscle strength, especially in the legs. The first of those is one of the earliest and most overlooked signs of that dysfunction. So let's get right into it. The first of those these are the 5 most common reasons your legs are getting weaker after 60, rooted in physiology, not folklore. If we're going to talk seriously about health span, about maximizing your quality of life, not just its duration, then we need to talk about muscle, not in the aesthetic sense, but structural and functional sense. And as you cross into your 60s, the first of those the conversation starts with a single word that doesn't get nearly the attention it should: sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength. But it's not just about muscle tissue vanishing. It's also about declining quality. Think of it as not just shrinking the engine, but also letting it rust from the inside. Muscle fibers, then, those would be the balance between fast and slow twitch fiber shifts unfavorably, and infiltration of fat tissue begins to occur inside the muscle, what we sometimes call marbling. Much like you'd see in a ribeye steak, but you don't want that inside your own body. This process actually begins around the age of 30, with muscle mass decreasing at a rate of approximately 1% per year. By the time you hit 60, the acceleration becomes more pronounced. If you're sedentary, the decline can be much faster, up to 35% annually. That means someone in their late 70s could have lost more than half of their peak muscle mass. This isn't just a statistical curiosity. It's a risk factor for disability, the dependence, falls, fractures, metabolic disorders, and death. Now, many people think of sarcopenia as something that just happens, like gray hair or wrinkles. But this is fundamentally incorrect. Sarcopenia is a condition, not an inevitability, and like other conditions, it can be treated, and better yet, prevented. We know from the data that muscle mass is one of the best predictors of longevity, and not just mass, but strength, your ability to generate force. That's a key distinction. Strength is more predictive of survival than muscle size alone. And when we say strength, we mean function. Would be your ability to get out of a chair without using your hands, to climb stairs, to carry groceries, to stand up after a fall. Without assistance, the first these are not cosmetic metrics. These are life and death metrics. When muscle mass declines, so does metabolic health. Muscle is the most metabolically active tissue in your body. It's the largest site for glucose disposal, which means it's crucial for insulin sensitivity. This is why muscle mass and the onset of insulin resistance often go hand in hand. The muscle doesn't just move you. It regulates your metabolism. It's a glucose sponge, a protein reserve, and a signaling organ all in one. And when you lose it, you don't just lose strength, you lose systemic resilience. The first of those so why does sarcopenia accelerate after age 60? There are several factors at play. One is a phenomenon called anabolic resistance, the reduced ability of aging muscle to respond to anabolic stimuli like dietary protein or resistance exercise. Would be when you're young, a modest amount of training or protein intake can stimulate significant muscle protein synthesis. But with age, the same stimulus produces a weaker response. Your body essentially becomes less efficient at building and repairing muscle. This is compounded by changes in hormone levels, testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1, all of which play a role in maintaining muscle mass. After 60, the first these hormones typically decline, and while they aren't the only factor, They are contributors to the anabolic resistance we observe. Would be, but perhaps the most important driver of sarcopenia is inactivity. The average person becomes significantly more sedentary with age. And the problem here is not just lack of movement, it's a specific lack of resistance-based movement. You cannot maintain muscle mass by walking or doing cardio alone. Those activities are beneficial for other reasons, but they don't provide the mechanical tension needed to stimulate hypertrophy or preserve strength. The first of those would be the resistance training is the single most effective intervention we have against sarcopenia. And the good news is that it works, even in older adults who've never trained before. In one study, of those be individuals in their 70s and 80s who engaged in resistance training for just 12 weeks experienced significant gains in muscle mass and strength. The first of those would be their muscle biopsy profiles down to the mitochondrial level began to resemble those of people 30 years younger. But you have to approach resistance training strategically. For older adults, it's not just about lifting heavy weights. It's about training intelligently to build strength, improve coordination, and minimize injury risk. That means working through full ranges of motion, emphasizing proper form, and progressing load over time. The first of those would be, this is not about bodybuilding. This is about preserving the ability to live independently. Nutrition is also critical. Those would be the elderly often consume inadequate protein, sometimes well below the minimum threshold need to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. For someone over 60, aiming for 1.6 to 20 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day is a reasonable target, assuming normal kidney function. Spacing protein evenly across meals with at least 30 grams per meal helps maximize the muscle building response. Leucine, a branched chain amino acid, is particularly important for signaling muscle protein synthesis via the MOR pathway. Sleep, too, plays an underrated role in muscle maintenance. Poor sleep disrupts hormone production, impairs recovery, and exacerbates catabolic processes. So does chronic inflammation, which increases with age. This so-called inflammaging can degrade muscle tissue indirectly. That's another reason why a healthy diet, regular exercise, and stress management are so critical. They're all anti-inflammatory. The downstream consequences of sarcopenia are sobering. Reduced mobility, increased frailty, higher fall risk, and worse outcomes in virtually every medical condition. For example, if you're hospitalized for any reason, say the first of those would be pneumonia or surgery, and you already have low muscle mass, your recovery will be longer, more complicated, and less successful. Sarcopenia is one of the strongest predictors of poor surgical outcomes, even in otherwise healthy people. What's the takeaway? Simply this. Those would be, muscle is your insurance policy. It's your pension plan for aging. It's the infrastructure that supports every movement, every task, every act of independence. The first of those would be, and it doesn't erode overnight. It erodes slowly, quietly, and then all at once. You don't notice it until you suddenly can't get up off the floor without using your hands, or at all. That's why you must begin addressing it now, not later. If you're over 60, start resistance training today. If you've already started, progress it. If you've been consistent, optimize it. Combine with adequate protein, quality sleep, and meaningful movement throughout the day. Sarcopenia is common, but it is not inevitable. Muscle is highly plastic. It responds to demand no matter your age, but the longer you wait, the steeper the hill becomes. And be very clearing, this isn't about vanity. It's about autonomy. The first of those would be, it's about reducing the odds that your final decade is spent in a wheelchair or a hospital bed. The first of those would be, it's about extending the runway of life with the strength to actually enjoy it. That's the standard we should be aiming for, would be. When we talk about aging, particularly in the context of declining physical performance, there's a tendency to focus exclusively on the muscles, bones, and joints. The first of those would be. But if we're truly trying to understand the root cause of why legs grow weaker after 60, we have to look much deeper. Beneath the muscle fibers, the first of those would be past the cellular membranes all the way down to the mitochondria. Mitochondria are small organelles inside your cells, thousands of them in each muscle cell, responsible for producing ATP, the currency of energy in the body. The first of those would be, they are often referred to as the powerhouses of the cell, but that metaphor undersells their importance. Thirstos would be, they're more like the energy infrastructure of the human body. And when they start to fail, which they inevitably do with age, your physical capabilities decline across the board. Now, the first of those would be, mitochondrial dysfunction isn't something you feel acutely at first. There's no warning light. The first of those would be, but you might notice it when you go up the stairs and your legs fatigue faster than they used to. Those would be. You might notice it when you try to carry groceries and you're more out of breath than expected. That creeping decline in endurance, those would be that slight heaviness in the legs. Those are the quiet signs of a failing mitochondrial network. As we age, several things happen at the mitochondrial level. First, mitochondrial biogenesis, the body's ability to produce new, healthy mitochondria declines. Second, existing mitochondria become less efficient at producing ATP. They start leaking electrons, which generates more reactive oxygen species. ROS, commonly known as free radicals. These molecules damage cellular structures, including the mitochondria themselves. It becomes a vicious cycle. Less energy production leads to more oxidative stress, which further impairs energy production. Over time, this erosion leads to measurable decreases in strength, endurance, and recovery capacity. This dysfunction is especially pronounced in skeletal muscle, which is one of the most mitochondria-dense tissues in the body. Muscles don't just require ATP during activity. They need it constantly, even at rest, to maintain baseline tone and function. So as mitochondrial function erodes, so too does the muscle's ability to contract efficiently, to recover from exertion, and to respond to training stimuli. In other words, even if you're exercising, poor mitochondrial health means you're not reaping the full benefits of your efforts. Another way this plays out is through impaired aerobic metabolism. Mitochondria are the engines of aerobic energy production. When they work well, the first of those would be your body can efficiently burn fat and glucose in the presence of oxygen to generate ATP. When they don't, would be your body becomes more reliant on anaerobic metabolism, which is far less efficient and produces metabolic byproducts like lactate, contributing to fatigue. So when you hit 60 and your walk feels harder, your legs burn faster, or you need longer to recover. It's not just age. It's a fuel crisis at the cellular level. Those would be. So what we do about this, the cornerstone of mitochondrial health, without exception, is aerobic exercise, particularly zone 2 training. This refers to a level of effort where your body's working hard enough to stimulate mitochondrial adaptation, but not so hard that it crosses over into anaerobic territory. Typically, this corresponds to 77% of your maximum heart rate, or an intensity where you can talk in full sentences but wouldn't want to. The first of those would be Zone 2 training acts as a mitochondrial stimulus. It encourages your body to build more mitochondria and to improve the function of existing ones. The first of those be the molecular signaling triggered by Zone 2 work, AMK activation, the PGC1F expression. Directly promotes mitochondrial biogenesis and increases the oxidative capacity of your muscle fibers. And this isn't theoretical. In one study, older adults who engaged in consistent aerobic training saw a significant reversal in age-related mitochondrial decline. Muscle biopsies revealed not only mitochondrial density, but also increased enzyme activity, improved glucose uptake, and better insulin sensitivity. Another important piece is that mitochondrial dysfunction contributes to metabolic disease, which in turn contributes to further muscle weakness. The first of those would be the clear link between impaired mitochondrial function and insulin resistance. When your mitochondria aren't oxidizing fuel effectively, the first would be lipids accumulate in the muscle cells, disrupting insulin signaling and promoting inflammation. This metabolic function compounds the physical decline and increases the risk for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity, all of which have direct implications for lower body strength and mobility. Supplementation can play a role here, but it's not a silver bullet. Nutrients like CoQ10, alpha lipoic acid, creatine, and L-carnitine have shown some promise in supporting mitochondrial function, particularly in aging populations. But again, the magnitude of effect from these interventions is small compared to the stimulus of properly dosed aerobic training. You cannot out-supplement a sedentary lifestyle. Sleep and circadian rhythm also factor into this equation. Mitochondrial function follows a circadian pattern. Your cells are more efficient at certain times of day. First, those would be poor sleep or irregular rhythms can desynchronize mitochondrial activity from metabolic demand. This means that even if you're eating well and exercising, poor sleep can impair mitochondrial regeneration, reduce energy availability, and increase inflammation. So optimizing sleep, both duration and timing, is not optional. The first of those would be. It's foundational. Let's also talk about fasting and caloric restriction. There's some evidence to suggest that time-restricted feeding and occasional fasting may promote mitophagy, the clearing out of damaged mitochondria to make room for healthy ones. However, fasting is a nuanced tool, especially in older adults, where the risk of losing lean mass becomes higher. If used, it must be applied judiciously and never at the expense of protein intake or muscle preservation. At the systems level, the first of those would be mitochondrial dysfunction doesn't degrade physical performance. It accelerates biological aging. Mitochondria communicate with your nucleus through retrograde signaling, influencing gene expression, inflammation, and cellular repair. When they fail, the first of those would be they send distress signals that promote senescence or cellular aging. So this isn't just about having more energy for your morning walk. It's about slowing the rate at which your body ages. The take-home message is this: if you're over 60 and feeling like your legs are giving out sooner than they used to, don't just look at the muscles. Look at the machinery behind the muscles. You would be. Because unless you're addressing mitochondrial health head on, you're only treating the symptom, not the cause. And the beautiful part is this: the first of those would be mitochondria are responsive. They're trainable. They don't care how old you are. They respond to demand. You can build new mitochondria. You can increase oxidative efficiency. You can restore metabolic flexibility, but you have to do the work. You have to provide the stimulus. So if you're not already, those would be: start prioritizing low intensity aerobic training multiple times per week. Walk briskly, cycle, use a rowing machine. Anything that keeps you in that sweet spot of zone 2 for 45 to 60 minutes at a time. Combine that with intelligent resistance training, adequate sleep, proper nutrition, and possibly some mitochondrial supportive compounds under guidance. Because the goal isn't just to stay alive. The goal is to stay capable, would be. And at the heart of capability, at the very base of physical and metabolic resilience, are your mitochondria. They deserve your full attention. When people think about declining strength with age, they usually jump straight to the muscles. And that's understandable. It's what we see. The thighs shrink, stair climbing gets harder, balance feels less steady. But what's much less obvious, and arguably more important, is the upstream cause, the nervous system. The first of those would be specifically the neuromuscular connection. It's not enough to have muscle. You have to be able to use it. And the ability to recruit, activate, and coordinate muscle tissue moment by moment, step by step, is dependent on a vast network of motor neurons that begins in the brain, travels through the spinal cord, and branches out like tree roots to the individual muscle fibers in your limbs. As we age, this system begins to fray. The decline is gradual, insidious, those would be, and invisible to the untrained eye. But over time, it has very real consequences on your physical performance, especially in the lower body. The technical term is motor unit remodeling, and understanding what this is and how to slow it down is essential if you want to preserve leg strength after 60. A motor unit is composed of a single motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. These units are the basic building blocks of voluntary movement. When you want to contract a muscle, say to stand up from a chair, your brain sends a signal through the spinal cord to activate specific motor units in your quadriceps, glutes, hamstrings, and calves. The timing, intensity, and coordination of these signals determines how smooth and powerful your movement is. In youth, this system is incredibly efficient. Motor neurons fire rapidly and precisely. You have a broad range of recruitment options. From small, low-threshold units for light activities like walking to large, high-threshold units for powerful movements like jumping or sprinting. But with aging, particularly after age 60, you begin to lose these motor neurons, especially the larger, faster ones. The remaining neurons try to compensate by sprouting new branches and adopting orphaned muscle fibers, but this process is imperfect. The result is twofold. First, you lose the ability to generate force quickly. Even if your muscle mass is relatively preserved, you may no longer be able to access it on demand. This is why muscle power, the ability to produce force quickly, is often more predictive of falls and frailty than raw strength or size. And second, your movement patterns become less efficient and more variable, increasing your risk of tripping, stumbling, or falling. This is what we mean by neuromuscular degradation. The first of those would be, it's the slow disintegration of the software that controls your muscles. Now, this loss doesn't just happen in isolation. It's accelerated by inactivity, inflammation, insulin resistance, and mitochondrial dysfunction, all of which are more prevalent after 60. Sedentary behavior, in particular, is a key driver. When you stop using high threshold motor units, they become deconditioned. The use it or lose it principle is a special Keurig. Those would be the units you use the least are the ones you lose first. And make no mistake, this loss has functional consequences. Studies show that older adults with lower motor unit numbers and firing rates have significantly impaired balance, slower walking speed, and worse outcomes in daily functional tasks like rising from a chair, climbing stairs, or maintaining posture under dynamic conditions. So what can we do? The answer lies in training the nervous system, not just the muscles. This means prioritizing exercises and activities that challenge motor control, balance, coordination, and rate of force development. In other words, you're not just trying to get stronger, you're trying to stay fast, precise, and stable. Let's start with power training. The first of those would be, while traditional resistance training is important for hypertrophy and strength, power training, using lighter weights moved at higher speeds, is essential for preserving high threshold motor units. Think of movements like kettlebell swings, medicine ball throws, or even sit to stand drills performed explosively, but safely. These movements specifically train the nervous system to activate muscle fibers quickly, something that is lost with age unless deliberately maintained. Then we have balance and proprioception work. Standing on one leg, walking heel to in a straight line, or performing movements on unstable surface are all ways to train your neuromuscular system to adapt, fire more precisely, and stay responsive. This might seem basic, FERS would be, but the data are clear. Balance training reduces fall risk, improves gait, and enhances confidence in movement, especially in older adults. Single leg strength training also deserves mention. Movements like split squats, step ups, and lunges challenge both strength and coordination. They expose asymmetries in motor control that bilateral two-leg movements might hide. The nervous system thrives on novelty and complexity. So unilateral work is like cognitive training for your body. Additionally, agility and reaction time drills, even very simple ones, can be immensely valuable. Tapping light pads in response to visual cues, catching and throwing a ball, B, or even playing pickle forces your nervous system to react quickly, coordinate complex inputs, and maintain dynamic stability. B, these are not just games, they are neuromotor training at its finest. Another key concept is movement variability. Most people past 60 tend to move in very repetitive, constrained ways. Same chair, same pace, same route. But the nervous system thrives on diverse movement, introducing novel, unpredictable movement patterns. Turning, would-be, twisting, adjusting. Keeps the motor units awake. The more ways you challenge your nervous system, the more resilient and functional it becomes. And let's not overlook the importance of cognitive health. The brain and muscles are part of the same system. Executive function, attention, B, and coordination all interact with movement. Dual task training, such as walking while doing mental math or balancing on one foot while reciting the alphabet backward, has been shown to improve both cognitive and motor performance in aging populations. The brain's ability to direct movement depends on its own integrity, and training them together yields the best results. What about technology, electromyography, EMG, reaction time testing, force plate assessments? These can offer objective insights into how your neuromuscular system is performing. And while you don't need these tools to get started, they can be useful for quantifying progress, identifying deficits, and tailoring your training. Now, one thing that must be said, none of this works without consistency. Neuromuscular adaptations require frequent and repeated stimulation. Once a week efforts are not enough. You need regular, purposeful practice, daily if possible, across a range of movement types and intensities. But the investment pays off. The first would be the preservation of motor units, and their function can literally extend your independence by years, even decades. To be clear, the goal is not to become an Olympic athlete at 70. The goal is to maintain the capacity to move through the world freely, to retain your reflexes and coordination, to avoid the slow shrinkage of your world that comes from fear of falling or not trusting your legs. This degradation is real, measurable, but it is also modifiable. You can train your neuromuscular system to stay sharp. You can teach your nervous system to keep firing. And in doing so, you preserve not just your legs, but your life as you know it. The cost of inaction is not weakness. It's fragility. The first as would be. But the reward of effort is not just strength. It's control. And that's a trade worth making every time. One of the more silent, yet profoundly influential changes that occurs with aging is the shifting hormonal landscape. First of those would be, it's easy to think of hormones as something reserved for discussions around adolescence or menopause. But the truth is, the hormonal changes that occur after age 60, particularly those that impact anabolic signaling, play a decisive role in why your legs and your body more broadly, first those would be begin to lose strength and functionality. Hormones are signaling molecules, chemical messengers that coordinate everything from metabolism and mood to muscle protein synthesis and repair. And as you get older, nearly every one of these signaling systems becomes less robust, less responsive, and less capable of triggering the adaptations needed to maintain strength, especially in the lower body. Let's begin with the king of anabolic hormones, testosterone. In both men and women, testosterone levels begin a slow, the steady decline starting in midlife, dropping approximate 1% per year after age 30. While this seems incremental, the cumulative effect by age 60 or 70 is substantial. Testosterone plays a critical role in promoting muscle protein synthesis, satellite cell activation, and neuromuscular signaling. In men, it's directly correlated with lean muscle mass, especially in the quadriceps and glutes. In women, although circulating testosterone is lower in absolute terms, it still exerts a meaningful influence on muscle preservation and strength. Testosterone isn't just about gaining muscle. It's about keeping it. With lower levels, the first of those would be the balance shifts toward catabolism. Your body becomes less efficient at repairing damaged muscle fibers, more prone to losing muscle during periods of inactivity, such as after an injury or illness, and less able to recover from training stress. But it doesn't stop there. Alongside testosterone is growth hormone GHH, which also declines sharply with age. GH is essential for stimulating the liver to produce IGF-1 insulin, like growth factor 1, the first of those would be, which acts directly on muscle tissue to promote growth and regeneration. IGF-1 is particularly critical in maintaining the satellite cells that repair and build muscle fibers after exercise. A reduction in this pathway not only impairs your ability to gain muscle, it delays recovery, increases soreness, and reduces the adaptive benefits of strength training. Those would be, what this means in practice is that even if you continue to train as you age, your hormonal environment is less favorable for making gains or even holding onto what you've already built. You're rowing against a stronger biological current. This is part of why training, like you used to, often yields diminishing returns after 60. The inputs haven't changed, but the hormonal milieu has. You need smarter, those would be more targeted strategies to compensate. Then there's insulin, a hormone we usually talk about in the context of glucose control, but which also has direct anabolic effects in skeletal muscle. Insulin facilitates the uptake of nutrients into muscle cells and prevents excessive muscle protein breakdown. But with age, insulin sensitivity typically declines, especially in the absence of regular resistance training and aerobic exercise. The result is a blunting of insulin's muscle-sparing effect. More glucose and amino acids are shunted into fat tissue instead of muscle, and this promotes a shift in body composition that favors sarcopenia and visceral adiposity. Women face another unique hormonal hurdle with the onset of menopause, typically in the early 50s, though its effects become more pronounced by 60. The drop in estrogen is not just a reproductive issue. It has systemic consequences. Estrogen plays a role in muscle quality, mitochondrial function, and inflammation. It influences how muscle repairs after damage, how efficiently mitochondria produce ATP, and how resilient muscle tissue is in the face of oxidative stress. When estrogen declines, you don't just lose bone mass. You lose part of your muscular defense system. The first of those would be, so what's the solution? Can you simply replace what's lost? Hormone replacement therapy, HRT, is one option. And it's not a fringe idea. It's a legitimate medical tool when used responsibly in men with confirmed testosterone deficiency. Not just age-related decline. Testosterone replacement therapy, NTRT, can improve lean body mass, muscle strength, and even mood and motivation. But TRT is not without risks. It requires careful monitoring of hematocrit, PSA levels, lipid profiles, and cardiovascular risk. It's a lever to pull, but it must be pulled with precision. For women, the estrogen replacement, particularly when initiated near the onset of menopause, has been shown to preserve muscle mass and strength, especially when combined with resistance training. But again, timing, dosage, and delivery method matter. The risks and benefits must be assessed individually. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here. For those not pursuing HRT, or for whom it's contraindicated, there are other strategies to optimize the hormonal environment. First of those would be, one of the most powerful is resistance training, especially compound lifts that recruit large muscle groups. The first would be lifting weights does more than build muscle. It temporarily increases testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1. It also improves insulin sensitivity and enhances the expression of genes involved in muscle repair and growth. Sleep is another major player. Deep, restorative sleep, particularly slow wave sleep, is the time when growth hormone is most heavily secreted. Sleep deprivation, even in the short term, blunts this release. The first of those would be reduces testosterone and increases cortisol. So if you're training hard but sleeping poorly, you're essentially digging a hole faster than you can fill it. Protein intake is critical as well. As you age, your muscle tissue becomes less sensitive to dietary protein, a phenomenon known as anabolic resistance. To overcome this, older adults need higher per meal doses of protein, ideally 340 grams per meal with at least 2.5 grams of lysine. The first of those would be the key amino acid that triggers muscle protein syntheses. Spread across the day, this helps stimulate muscle repair more effectively and compensates for the less responsive hormonal landscape. There are also emerging therapies that aim to mimic the anabolic effects of hormones without the systemic risks. These include selective androgen receptor modulators, ASRMs. The first of those would be myostatin inhibitors and growth hormone secretagogues. While promising, most are still under investigation or have safety concerns that preclude routine use, at least for now. First of those would be, what's important to understand is that hormonal decline is not destiny. It's a variable, an important one, but not a fixed endpoint. The slope of decline can be slowed and in many cases partially reversed with the right inputs, training, nutrition, sleep, stress reduction, and possibly pharmacological support. But it requires proactivity, waiting until your legs are noticeably weaker, waiting until you fall or can't get out of a chair unassisted. Means you've already lost critical ground. Hormonal decline is slow, but so is its reversal. You need to be ahead of it, not reacting to it. So if you're past 60 and noticing your legs don't feel as strong, as stable, or as reliable, look beyond the muscles themselves. Ask what signaling is or isn't getting through. Consider what the internal environment is telling your body about growth, repair, and recovery. Because strength is not just about lifting more weight. The first of would be, it's about hormonal alignment. It's about supporting the biological signals that tell your body, keep building, would be, don't break down. And those signals aren't passive. They respond to what you do, what you eat, how you sleep, and how you train. Those would be. Which means you're not at the mercy of age. You're in the driver's seat. You just have to take the wheel and not let go. When we talk about aging and strength loss, we often think in mechanical terms, muscles shrinking, bones weakening, tendons stiffening. But beneath the surface, driving much of this visible decline is a far more insidious, forcey chronic inflammation. It's the quiet saboteur of aging. The first of those would be, it doesn't announce itself with pain or swelling the way acute inflammation does. It doesn't come with a fever or redness or the typical signs we associate with immune response. Instead, it lingers, smoldering at low levels throughout your tissues, circulating in your bloodstream, slowly degrading function over decades. This state is so pervasive in older adults that researchers have coined a term for IDEG, first to be inflammaging. And it's not just an academic curiosity. Chronic low-grade inflammation is a major upstream cause of sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass and function. And it plays a central role in why your legs, in particular, weaken so dramatically after age 60. Let's start with the biology. Inflammation is, at its core, an immune response. It's your body's way of recognizing damage, sending out chemical messengers, cytokines, and initiating repair. In the short term, this is helpful, even essential. You want inflammation after a tough workout or injury. But when inflammation becomes chronic due to metabolic dysfunction, visceral fat, oxidative stress, poor sleep, the first of those would be, or autoimmune activation, it begins to do the opposite of repair. It breaks things down. In muscle tissue, the first of those would be chronic inflammation suppresses the anabolic signaling pathways that are necessary for growth and repair. The most important of these is the mTOR pathway. Those would be, which is essential for muscle protein synthesis. Inflammatory cytokines like TNF and IL-6 interfere with this process, reducing the ability of muscle to regenerate after injury or exercise. Over time, this leads to reduced muscle quality, impaired recovery, and eventually atrophy. Those would be the legs are particularly vulnerable here because they contain a disproportionate share of your total muscle mass, particularly in the quads, glutes, hamstrings, and calves. The first of those would be these muscles are highly metabolically active and depend on constant turnover and remodeling to maintain their function. When chronic inflammation is present, those would be the balance shifts from synthesis to degradation. Proteolytic systems like the ubiquitin proteasome pathway become more active, breaking down muscle proteins at a faster rate than they can be replaced. This isn't just theory. We have data. In cohort studies of older adults, elevated markers of systemic inflammation, such as C-react protein, CRP, IL-6, and TNF-FL, are strongly associated with lower muscle mass, reduced grip strength, slower walking speed, and increased risk of disability. These associations persist even after adjusting for confounding variables like age, sex, BMI, and comorbid conditions. In other words, inflammation is not just a byproduct of aging. It is a driver of it. It doesn't stop at muscle either. Chronic inflammation also damages the endothelium, the thin layer of cells that line your blood vessels. This impairs blood to working muscle tissue, limiting oxygen and nutrient delivery. Capillary density in skeletal muscle decreases, especially in sedentary individuals, further reducing the ability of the legs to perform and recover. This leads to fatigue. It would be impaired endurance and ultimately a self-reinforcing cycle. Weaker legs mean less movement. Less movement means more inflammation, and more inflammation means further degradation. Now layer in chronic disease, conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, rheumatoid arthritis, and even depression. And the picture becomes more complicated, but also more actionable. These conditions aren't just associated with inflammation, they are sources of it. They take type 2 diabetes. Chronically elevated blood glucose causes glycation of proteins and lipids, which produces advanced glycation end products, AGEs. These AGEs activate inflammatory pathways in muscle tissue and impair insulin signaling. The first of those would be, which, if you followed the previous discussion, directly inhibits the muscle's ability to take up nutrients and synthesize protein. So even if you're eating enough protein, your body may not be metabolically enough to use it effectively. Or consider cardiovascular disease. Atherosclerosis is fundamentally an inflammatory condition. The same inflammatory cytokines that destabilize arterial plaques also impair muscle regeneration. And medications used to treat these conditions, while often necessary, can sometimes have catabolic side effects, further compounding the loss of muscle strength. Obesity, first those would be, particularly visceral fat, is per most potent source of chronic inflammation. Visceral fat acts as an endocrine organ, secreting pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 and resistin. It doesn't just sit there inertly. It actively poisons your internal environment. First, those would be. And because this fat tends to accumulate around the midsection and organs, it's particularly harmful for leg strength. The first those would be creating a situation where the muscles are being asked to support more weight while being simultaneously sabotaged from the inside. First, those would be even conditions that seem unrelated, like chronic stress or depression, have inflammatory consequences. Elevated cortisol levels from stress or dysregulated cytokine profiles from depression impair sleep, increase central fat accumulation, and reduce physical activity, all of which feed the inflammation muscle loss cycle. So what can be done? Step one is to identify the sources of inflammation in your own life and eliminate or mitigate them. For many, this begins with visceral fat reduction. This isn't about aesthetics. It's about removing a key source of systemic inflammation. Interventions here include low insulin, low diets, ketogenic or low carb Mediterranean, zone 2 aerobic training, and resistance training, all of which improve insulin sensitivity and reduce cytokine load. Sleep is another major lever. Poor sleep increases levels of IL-6 CRP almost immediately, and chronic sleep deprivation impairs glucose metabolism and immune regulation. 8 hours of high-quality, uninterrupted sleep is not a luxury. It's a foundational strategy for reducing inflammation and preserving strength. Next, we have exercise, but with a caveat. While exercise acutely increases inflammation, especially eccentric training, it leads to a long-term anti-inflammatory adaptation. This includes reductions in TNF-alpha, improvements in insulin sensitivity, increases in anti-inflammatory cytokines like IL-10, and reductions in visceral fat. But dosage and recovery matter. Overtraining without recovery can worsen inflammation, especially in older adults with poor sleep or comorbid conditions. This is why intelligently programmed training, emphasizing consistency, progression, and deloading, is crucial. Then there's nutrition. The first, those would be anti-inflammatory. Eating is not about taking turmeric and fish oil. Those may help. It's about reducing the burden of ultra-processed, hyper-palatable, high glycemic. The first of those would nutrient-poor foods that create metabolic chaos. A diet rich in omega-3 fats, polyphenols, high-quality protein. The first would be, and micronutrients provides the raw meals of muscle repair and the systemic support to keep inflammation in check. Pharmacologic interventions can also play a role in select cases. Metformin, statins, SGLT2 inhibitors, and GLP-1 receptor agonists have been shown to lower inflammatory markers and improve metabolic health. But these are not silver bullets. They are tools. And they must be deployed with precision in the context of a broader lifestyle framework. Ultimately, the message here is simpleg. The first with chronic inflammation is not an inevitable byproduct of aging. It's modifiable. It's upstream. First of those would be. And it's one of the most important variables you can influence if your goal is to preserve strength, particularly in the legs after age 60. You cannot afford to let inflammation run in the background unchecked. It won't scream, it will whisper. But over time, that whisper becomes a drag on your vitality, a weight you carry into every movement, every step, every attempt to live the life you want. And the tragedy is most people never know it's there until their legs give out. But you're not most people. You know it now. And you can do something about it.